So we'll go right into the questions. But first, I just want to say that we will have a Q&A section at the end. So if you have any questions that you'd like our panelists to ask at the end, there is a Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And you can ask that throughout the webinar, and we'll answer those at the end. So our first question, what was going through your mind when the news of the Biogen outbreak came out? Did you think COVID-19 would become as big of a problem as it did?
Which one of those do you want to start? Go ahead,
I could jump in with a short answer, and that I knew a number of people that had contracted it early, and strangely, even though one of them was an international traveler, he was at home for weeks, and so then this was in the Bay Area, so certainly had this realization that there were going to be a number of people, if in my extended network, I already knew some very early on. So I think that there were some indications just from the people we knew that there's a chance that this would have a large presence, particularly even if people had no clear interactions with the hotspots.
And Brian or Mark, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think when all of this started, I was actually abroad for a large stretch of time for work when all of this was happening. And actually, I was abroad when the Biogen issue happened. And before that, you know, we didn't know how infectious it was going to be. When you heard about the spread of that issue at a single conference, you realized that it was very infectious and probably was precipitous. And I was actually abroad when the potential travel ban was enacted. So we hustled back to New York City, which I don't know if that was a good move or not, but it is what it is. And so, yeah, it was just, I think a bit eye-opening that, you know, it was probably more infectious than maybe we had understood beforehand.
Right.
Yeah, and I was following it a bit earlier. I think the Biogen outbreak was really an eye-opener of saying, hey, here's how easily this could cluster and actually break out in your own communities. But I think when you first started seeing cases pop up in California, and this is back in January, and there wasn't like a clear community spread, but once that happened, and then people were talking about 14-day incubation or contagion period, asymptomatic, that was when it's like, okay, this is getting serious. So Biogen to me was just kind of like it was unfortunate, but it was a reinforcement, and I wasn't necessarily expecting it to come down as hard as it was. I can tell probably pretty much anyone sitting here maybe at one point Googled Spanish flu epidemic and try to, kind of use that as a template for saying how would things go. But I think we're in uncharted territory, and the news was unfortunate, but at the same time, I think all of us have seen some interesting opportunities that are coming out of this COVID, from not only ways of working, but also really eye-opening on supply chain dependencies and risks that I think a lot of us may have taken for granted before it happened.
Right. And with the FDA fast-tracking drugs due to the pandemic, do you expect to see drug approval processes move faster in the future, given the possibility of another pandemic? TJ?
I think that historically there's always been some reluctance to move too quickly, but I think that one understands the weight of this, and it's hard to look at our government as as one that maybe would be the most science-based. So we hope that all things would be weighed in a proactive and scientific way. So I'm kind of hopeful that we'll evaluate this and move forward quickly.
Right. Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. It's less of my area on FDA approvals, but I think overall, you've seen what makes me wonder is you've seen a huge focus in time and resources in COVID-19. And I think all of us get the fierce publications, and you say, oh, it's COVID, fears, and vaccine manufacturing capacities, investments. It's a race to the top. I think whoever really comes out with an effective vaccine or treatment to this, winner take all marbles here. Now, what will that have as an effect on overall approval processes? It's interesting in that the agency, I think, is been a little bit more focused on moving therapies that can help the COVID-19 epidemic and get the economy back on track, from it being like accepting manufacturing facilities overseas a bit quicker. Like I think Biocon's an excellent example in how quickly they moved through their 483 issues in Malaysia. But at the same time, I think it's to be seen after this passes, say the next 18 months, or whether or not there's a sustained change and a sustained momentum in changing how we work and how we approach as an industry, making sure that the safety of patients first.
Right. And Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, a bit what TJ was saying. I think that there's a bit of a reluctance, obviously, to fast track things for safety concerns, and so I don't really anticipate that. And also, dealing with interacting with the regulatory agency, especially the FDA recently, is I mean, they're having trouble keeping up with staffing, currently with, I think, more cell and gene therapy applications coming in. And so I don't know if that's going to be the approach. Whenever I hear this, there's an old, I think it's a Chinese proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And so maybe it'll start to get some thinking like, we need to plant these things now for the next one coming. And because you see frequently in the news, the surprise that people have that the fastest we can get a vaccine is in a year or something like that, when that's incredibly fast. But I think there's a lack of awareness at kind of what it takes to get those ready to go into general populations. And hopefully that the education we're kind of all getting real time will help to reinforce that, to get some things in the pipeline now for what's coming. Maybe not what's here is right now.
Yeah, Brian, I completely agree. I think this it's a great opportunity if it's an innovation engine, as to whether or not we can actually do things quicker. Yeah, I very much agree with your sentiment there.
Okay, great. I'm gonna kind of switch gears here over to hiring. So Brian, what are the current trends you're seeing in the market from both a hiring and a candidate standpoint, post-COVID and post-city shutdown?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, we're in New York City, and so we've been on, essentially work from home for most people since about mid-March. I think in general, the field's still very competitive. There's if you're in the cell and gene therapy, experienced people with cell and gene therapy experience, I think it's still a very competitive field for people. Hiring depends on probably the stage you're at. If you're a startup, if you're still in a non-revenue generating phase, or if you're in a generating phase, it probably differs a bit. But I think also with the hiring process, it's a little bit unusual because I think every candidate that I interview now always asks questions about the stability of the company, which you wouldn't get all the time. When you get interviews, it's something that they might ask, but usually not frequently. And I think also, usually our initial screen was a phone call or a Zoom call to begin with, and then it's also your second screen and your third screen now. And so bringing people on site, and that kind of that interaction or feeling that you're trying to get from them, and also that allow them to understand kind of the company has gone away a bit. And so I think that when you're looking for like culture fits and things like that is a little bit harder to assess. But I think everyone is understanding of the situation that we're in.
Right. I certainly think there's probably an increased kind of acceptance of the Zoom early call. Before, I think more often we'd always just have a phone chat or two in the initial discussions. And now you could easily jump into the Zooms. Whereas even, I don't know, 6 months ago, that just seemed probably a little unusual to people.
Right.
Right. And Mark, do you have anything to say?
Not as much. I mean, to me, it's great to see. Speaking to a friend of mine who's at NIBR there in Cambridge for Novartis, and I asked him, I said, how's COVID changing, the way that they work? Are they going to let you work from home for a while or whatever? He said, forever. Well, what do you mean? He's like, no, they said that, there's in a way, there's been a bit of a paradigm shift, at least for his department. They're like, look, if you don't have to be here, don't be here. And I think people are finding, remote work, but from a talent market perspective, I'd say it really opens the door. In a lot of people's like, okay, if you're based in Boston or New York or wherever, or let's say down in Texas, a massive biotech hotspot down in Texas, right? How are you going to recruit talent down there? It's not the easiest thing when you're not in a hub area. And now with the COVID, it's kind of taught, hey, Zoom works, remote working works, especially knowledge working, so you can be for anything. I think it's actually going to make talent and recruitment conversations very interesting. And furthermore, I don't know that I've seen a massive impact in the market. Maybe a pullback in some hiring to kind of see where the chips land, whether it be with clinical programs or funding. But I mean, overall, I think biotech's come through this relatively unscathed, if not needed more.
Okay, and that kind of
I was going to just jump in. One of the ASGCT mentoring sessions or lunch sessions, there was a discussion, and a couple of people were commenting that they were continuing to hire and continuing to onboard during this period, which is certainly a good sign. I imagine there was a downturn, obviously, a month ago. But it was interesting, the discussions of obviously you'd have to onboard this whole way. And so that's continuing, at least at some levels, I would guess.
Yeah, I'd agree. TJ, I mean, you guys probably see this a little bit more, within your organizations, but what's the pandemic really affected? And that's labor. It's the ability to go into the lab or, for the delivery driver or logistics to go from point A to point B. It's its ability to be like around people. It's actually an impact on the accessibility and mobility of labor. And for knowledge-based work, there's absolutely no effect. Frankly, I think technology has allowed us to get past that. But if you're hiring in for the labs or researchers, to actually move your therapies forward and solve problems, I think companies still have to work that out, but that may have slowed down a bit. But I think as we all figure this out, we'll definitely find ways to move it forward.
Right, and that kind of leads me into my next question is, how do you think this will affect businesses moving forward, as well as work from home productivity and efficiency?
I'll go first on this one if that's right. I mean, I think, similar to, we've already alluded to it. I mean, I think there's certainly some companies that have already identified that, more flexible schedules are appropriate. You saw that Twitter just came out recently and said, yeah, if you want to work from home for forever, that's fine. And so I think, again, what Mark said, the thought process, scientific, knowledge of things and, thinking about programs can be done anywhere, and I think that's what we're recognizing. And there's much better programs now. You have Zoom, you have BlueJean. There's 10 or 15 of these that are good platforms. And it comes to labor, and I think that's what it comes to is lab. But I think not only internally but externally, I think companies being aggressive from the front and just being transparent in how they're going to manage things if you were going to encounter another similar situation. And so it's I think those have been now, because I don't know what TJ and Mark think, but for us, we really haven't slowed down much. It's pretty much the same process. I mean, I think if you're running a clinical trial, the gating factor is your patients and making sure that they're safe, and that the hospitals that they have identified as our clinical sites are not overwhelmed with COVID responses, which we have to be cognizant of. And if they are, then that's something we have to manage.
Okay. And
go
ahead.
No, I fully agree. And again, it's the access and the ability of labor. I mean, like, for example, it's about whether or not you can get patients to your clinic, or whether or not your clinic has staff to actually do that's not seen as an essential task. And this is what I've seen more. My field's more in the manufacturing and the drug supply itself, than in clinical trial management. What I've seen is especially in the pandemic hit, the impact was definitely in trials. You saw trial slowdowns. It's like, okay, what are we going to do about supply? What are we going to do about moving supply? Especially if you're running international. If you were moving from, say, US, where you had a central hub of drug supply, and this is, of course, not a autologous mode, but if you're trying to move from US to Europe, it was anyone's guess, especially in the early days, about clearing customs. Now it's gotten a little bit more predictable, but now what you're seeing is a crunch of actually getting airplane space, because there's far less flights. And, on that side, I think was an impact. But what I see coming, and I'd love to, you gentlemen, if you see the same thing, Brian and TJ, is whether or not, companies are starting to rethink their supply chain strategies. And I think that's going to come. I think it's not only a look at, you hear it on the news where, okay, what do we need? What can manufacturing can be moved back from China? That's not an impact, really, in my opinion, in the cell and gene therapy world. It's more of a small molecule, maybe some biologics, but is starting to think about, okay, where do we have dependencies? What redundancies do we have? How do we manage inventory? Because if you have a problem with logistics and moving things from A to B with labor, inventory is really your answer. So how do you balance, having inventory there locally so you can access the materials that you need to keep moving your operation forward, or at your contract manufacturing operations, and the cost of that versus the benefit it brings you in not having such a disruption. And I think this is what some companies are, if they haven't started to think about it, they will.
Okay.
Well, I think one aspect certainly that is often discussed and might put more weight on it is the concept of who are your single source providers. And if everything is dependent on one place in your process, and there's some reason that's disrupted, whether it's because of some kind of pandemic or mergers and acquisition or other outside force. So this added more weight to, another reason that those are key problems that one has to address.
Absolutely, TJ. And I've seen the same thing, not only single sourcing, and now here's the thing, everyone rushes to second sourcing. And which one of you had the Chinese proverb, the right time to plant a tree was 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Or the right time to have started to think about that type of redundancy was actually yesterday or a year ago, when you're just starting to get into actual clinical supply, i.e. manufacturing for your phase one. How do I ensure redundancy? But it's also, I think, go along with relationships, because even if you want to try to onboard a second supplier, everyone else is too. So, where do you stand with the relationships with your supplier? Have you built those bridges? Have you had those conversations? And that's exactly what we're doing, within our own consultancy. We put a really good emphasis in building those partnerships so that it's more of a, if you would, a soft lever. It's like, hey, can you help me out? Versus, hey, I've got this demand. Can you give me a quote now? Because everyone else is approaching it that way. It's thinking, okay, how do you actually develop that relationship management with the second sourcing that's built into your phase one manufacturing so you can qualify those new suppliers, you can try out their materials, you can align the specifications as you move into phase two and phase three. And then this sets you up with those early investments, the tree 20 years ago, for commercialization, and that's kind of what I think on that.
Right. And I guess for Brian, for companies who are outsourcing work to CMOs, CROs, CDMOs, I know Rocket does that as well. How have travel bans and restrictions affected companies' pipelines?
Sure. And so I think, fortunately, I can't talk specifically about some of the CMOs, but I think, pretty early on, We recognize that they took aggressive measures for protecting their own staff and limiting their own travel. And so I think, again, what Mark alluded to a while ago, the biggest issue is to make sure that the operators remain safe and working in a safe environment, because they're the ones who interact. If they are in clean rooms together, they're in clean rooms together. And so I think, make sure that you have, proper staffing for that to support it. And I think, for the most part, and then have an action plan. If they do have someone that comes up COVID positive, how do they assess that, and how do they, assess the risk to the other operators, other people in the facility. And I think for the most part, our experience is that people have done a very good job about, managing the issues. And I think that's both been domestic and the EU. And so, for us, the manufacturing, because, and we've been fortunate with kind of the organization structure at the clinical sites, because we do use autologous products. And so that very much directly links clinical sites to your CMOs and well. So we have to have those considerations in us. So, I mean, I think, we planned a while ago, have several swim lanes for suppliers and materials moving around that have to be leveraged in these times. And if you can do that, I think the CMOs can manage that. And then, the other issue is if you have people go on site. I mean, that's something that I think most places have across the board shut down, and understandably. And so if you managed your partners through those kind of activities, how are you going to manage that now? Again, working remotely, if you have to review documentation, how are you going to do that properly in a controlled fashion? Is something that I think us and others are figuring out as we go at this point.
Mark or TJ, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Go ahead,
I think
TJ.
at least I'm set. I think I'm set.
Okay. And I'll kind of switch it now over to R&D. How have efforts slowed down how have efforts impacted R&D due to COVID?
Well, certainly there's been a decrease in non-essential and non-clinical trial work. And so some of the groups that I've been talking to recently have been trying to figure out what other aspects they can jump on. Can they reanalyze a certain set of data a different way? Can they do some things that are outside of the ones that are directly linked to new lab work? And so they were processing large data sets and doing machine learning, a few of the steps that they can do computationally. But there's still this need for some of the projects that weren't moving at the moment to generate new data. And so I think they were spending more time planning and getting those ready so that once they opened up, that they could jump on those with the kind of well-designed experiments to take the best advantage of the time and they have currently to research it and plan.
And circling back to the CMO question, CMO, CRO, I think the lack of travel has caused companies to we're relying more on paper diligence processes and such. I think eventually, once we get back to, say, like in Massachusetts, phase 3, phase 4, we will find ourselves wanting to follow up on high risk areas. But recommendation that I have for a lot of innovators is to make sure that you've mapped out what those high risk materials might be, and which suppliers are ones that you might want to take a little bit deeper look at their quality systems. So you first do it by paper audit, but once all this stuff lifts, I think you will see a little bit more of the face-to-face type meetings, but and visits mostly to due diligence and to make sure that people are producing under the appropriate quality standards.
Okay. And just kind of have to go into this at this day and age, but how has funding been affected due to COVID-19, and what would you recommend to biotechs who are trying to fundraise during this economic climate? Mark, do you want to start?
I think it if you can get the money, it's there. I mean, look, interest rates are next, or actually pretty much zero. You know, it's the cheap. It's caused just such a glut of cash, and then you see not only through, say, the CARES Act, but even in the background with the you know, Federal Reserve backstopping all types of debt instruments and everything. It's there's this enormous capital in the market in general. You know, I think what you're going to see is a you know, increased packaging of this. You know, so the cash will be there. It's available. It's just, you know, as always, you've got to have a really strong product. But I think there will be an appetite. You know, once a degree of uncertainty in the overall market stabilizes, there'll be an appetite for investment, just because there's just such cheap capital at the moment to be had.
Okay. Do either of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know just enough about this to be dangerous, and that's about it. But it's usually not in my realm. But I think, you know, generally, whenever if you're early on considering, you know, early raises or raises after you've gone public, I think, you know, a lot of what people are looking for are a bit more long-term investment. And so I think investors, that's what you're kind of looking for, people that are for the long haul, that understand kind of the process. And so I think those kind of people are kind of what you're looking for anyhow. And so maybe some of the short-term might not be so keen on it. But again, I think the long-term kind of quality investor that are in the field for a long time are still there. And like Mark was saying, I think, you know, people still see the value. Clearly, we're going to get through this, and we're seeing a lot of success in the fields that we're in. And, you know, we see, you know, companies, you know, getting through BLAs, getting to BLAs soon. So I think people see the long-term projection of the biologics as very valuable. And I think that's going to be borne out in the long run. And then I think, you know, if you considered grant funding, you know, hopefully, maybe if there's a silver lining to this, is people will see like the investment in some basic research to get things going earlier on to prepare for some of these things down the road might improve, because, you know, the funding there has not been robust for NIH and other organizations. And so hopefully that will, if there's a side effect of this, that'll be it.
Right. Okay. And I guess from a VC's point of view, do you think that investors have any preference at this point in investing in companies with late stage products that might be less risky versus preclinical stage products, which might be less upfront money?
At least in the few recent discussions, they certainly we're trying to understand the risk and weigh accordingly. And so there's still an effort to put in due diligence to understand exactly. And I think that's the answer to the previous question. There's just been a bit of bottlenecks. The people that needed to sign off on things, a few of the legal documents, they've all been slightly delayed, just because of the difficulties in infrastructure, getting things you know, from point A to B and such have been a little bit delayed. So it seems that there's an interest across the board, but it requires maybe a more circuitous route to get the information that you need to move forward.
Okay. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I you know, agree along those same lines. And I think, you know, versus the preclinical versus late phase, I mean, I think we know we're in a situation right now that isn't likely going to be, you know, very long term. So I think there's likely an appetite for both. And I think, you know, if it shows promise, and, you know, the more success there are in the field with these different applications, only makes, you know, the promise for even early stage work more attractive for investors and other groups.
Right. So I'll kind of switch over now to ASGCT. So what did you guys think of the ASGCT setup? What did you like about it? What did you dislike about it? The whole virtual aspect of it?
So in my opinion, the thing I liked the most, it was much easier to jump around to different, you know, different talks and things like that. It was I think, you know, ASGCT is not like an ASH or something like that yet, but it's getting larger, and I think going between the talks is somewhat challenging. So I really like the accessibility was nice, and it was to me that was the kind of the nicest aspect of it for sure.
Okay. And
to amplify that point, it has grown so remarkably fast that when they booked the hotel rooms years in advance, and they had twice the numbers that they had when they booked it, it made for a difficult time. They had to switch the posters from landscape to portrait one of the recent years, just because they could not find enough wall space, space on those dividers to get them in. And so this has been a challenge for the organizers because they had to book out the venues so far in advance. So there was this excitement about going to the Heinz Convention Center. And so, the fact that there was, I think, according to what I saw online, 6,000 attendees, and that, as Brian was mentioning, it's just growing so quickly. That would have been a challenge in the previous years to get anywhere near that, because the year previous they had 4,000 and change. And so it's just growing so quickly. It's going to be difficult to jump around. And last year, that a lot of the rooms were full, or you were in a tent in the hallway, and these kind of things. So it's allowed to a much larger number of people to attend. And I think I've heard from even another series that I have going for virtual gene editing talks, that there's excitement for people on the other side of the planet to be able to engage here. And one of the things that worked really well at the ASGCT was the ability to ask questions. I know a few are coming in here. And then at the ASGCT, there was a chance to upvote ones. There was the chance for people who had recorded their presentations to jump on and start answering the simple ones and save some of the other ones to do orally at the end. There was a chance for some panel discussions. So there were some things that were easier to do. I think the poster sessions were a little harder just because it wasn't done in the same kind of system, and uploading them and having a chance to chat at them wasn't quite as exciting as the real situation. Plus, there was a slightly smaller number of posters.
Right. And based on how ASGCT went on virtually, do you think that will have a bigger option for some of the bigger conferences in the future, such as JP Morgan?
It's already impacted bio.
Right.
Bio was to be set here in about 3 weeks or so, and it's entirely online right now. And I'm kind of interested to see how it goes. One of these conferences like JP Morgan and Bio and such is an excellent, and this is one of the questions I think one of our attendees had, is whether or not this has a detriment to businesses and their culture, the remote and not being there. And I have to say, I think it does. And I think there's a lot of power to be had from being able to attend conferences and events and actually, intermingle in person. It's just how we're wired as people, socially. But Bio is a great case study, given it's so recent and they've gone completely virtual to see, additionally how that type of impact will be.
Yeah, I agree completely. Without the human interactions, you don't have the chance for networking. You don't have the chance for kind of follow-up questions after you hear something exciting. You used to be able to kind of grab the guy in the hall, get in one more question. And then there was also the chance for kind of serendipitous interactions where you just kind of bump into someone, your friend introduces you. There might have been one of those on one of the nighttime Zooms that we were hosting to try and just bring back a little bit of the interactions. So I think I got one collaboration sound like it was kind of, pulled from one of these discussions. But I think a lot of that is what it's great about. You see the same people for 10 years running, and you can kind of pop in and ask questions and ask about, hey, did you see this talk? And so I think that there's undoubtedly going to be some efforts to put in some aspects of that. With just the quick timing, I don't think they were all in place yet for the ASGCT.
Victoria, we can't hear you.
Aha! So it failed on her. It's not just me.
So I was saying, what were some of the hottest topics discussed at ASGCT?
I'll start with one. I think, because we're also in the AAV space, we were really excited to see the Pfizer DMD data that came out. it's really exciting. It looks good. It's an indication that people have gone after for a very long time with AAV, and it's also very challenging because of the systemic delivery. But they showed really promising results. So it's very good to see the doses they were using, what they're doing, the manufacturing they're doing. It was, I think, is very promising. It's nice, very nice to see.
TJ, do you have anything to add to that?
I had it's on my list of things to watch. There's a few more of the discussions of the clinical data that are coming out, in addition to the Pfizer one, which was some people have flagged. I had a session at one of the times as those, but these are online, so we can continue to catch up. I think that it's certainly interesting as we bring these technologies in such rapid time. Strangely enough, some of the more cutting or breaking news abstracts were coming out even after the ASGCT for EHA or ASCO. So there's a pile that were presented here, and I think we'll continue to hear about them in the clinical settings as we go forward. And so I think there was lots of advances in a number of different areas, but I think that just the progress to patients is one that is really jumping to people.
Right. And do you think there's anything controversial that was brought up at ASGCT?
I struggled with this one. I didn't have anything particularly controversial. I mean, I think there's always alternate opinions on things, and I didn't see anything particularly controversial, but maybe TJ or Mark did.
TJ?
Aside from the Biogen question.
I mean, there's certainly there are groups and there's data that you wonder how it'll hold up, let's say, and but those are kind of few and far between, and so I think one of the things about publishing work and presenting work is that it gives others the chance to repeat and see if it reproduces, see if it adds to their work, and so occasionally just seeing things that you wouldn't have expected to work. Then you can go back and try that and see if in fact is something that you want to build on, or if it really didn't make sense and there was some other explanation.
Right. And TJ, question for you. I know with the CRISPR diagnostic test kit that just got approved for COVID-19, what do you think that means for CRISPR in the future?
I think it's interesting because it displays a different use, and this one was presented was one of the two companies and one of the three different diagnostics platforms. So it's interesting that there are numerous ways to do this, but it's employing a different molecule than the widely used staph pyogenase Cas9. And so I think that's interesting because it helps highlight the fact that there are new proteins that we can pull out, whether it's bioinformatically or through other means, and there's new ways to use those. And that what might not seem as a feature that was exploited to allow this amplification of the signal. So I think there's lots of kind of take-home messages that, just as we were kind of hinting before, there's the idea of this system or even tailings before it are things that wouldn't necessarily jump out as, oh, wow, this is an area that if we put money as a government or a funding agency, that it would directly lead to gene editing. But, thank God that, there's a certain amount of funding that comes through, and then scientists work diligently to progress these. So there's hopes that we can continue to fund and do these types of basic research that might lead to something askew from using a bacterial protein as a diagnostic tool.
Right. Brian, you're more on the AAV lenti side of things. So how do you think that kind of affects the future?
I think it's only positive, and I think when you see CRISPR, and not that there aren't issues on the lenti AAV side either, but I think with CRISPR, if you start to see diagnostics, that means that you're going to have to produce a lot of this at a very consistent quality going forward. And so I think that the manufacturing aspects that could go into the diagnostics could be leveraged for the field across the board, because I think there's a variety of ways to go about CRISPR approaches. And I think, TJ would know this much more than myself, but I think also like the manufacturing aspects of those are not in their infancy, but probably have not been explored as much. And so something like this will really drive a lot of those activities as well, which will only benefit everyone else in that space.
Right. Mark,
I was going to just jump in, and we continue to use CRISPR for library screenings, for research purposes, for diagnostics. All this information about its specificity, its activity, all can kind of be put together. Sometimes you say, well, in this instance, it was used in the lentivirus screen, and therefore the training set doesn't directly apply to mammalian use in therapeutic. But again, you can aggregate all this information. So it's great that we continue to gather information in the few years that we've been using these kind of reagents this way. And so I think that it all kind of dovetails together and helps us learn more about the system. And as Brian was mentioned, the manufacturing and the look at other new proteins, et cetera, all helps the use even for therapeutic targeting that we tend to, that usually gets the limelight.
Great. And Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
No, nowhere near on the same level as these two gentlemen.
All right. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'll do some questions from Q&A. We'll see how many we can get through. The first one is, how do you think this pandemic may change societal cultures overall in its perspective on the science community, and how do you think it might change scientific culture?
I mean, I think we've alluded to it a couple of times, but I hope that it shows the importance of investing in in the basic research and this kind of activities early on. You hope that's the message that's conveyed, and that people are a bit able to sift through some of the other information that's out there. I think also maybe beginning to listen to expertise in these areas, and because I think if even myself looking back, I think if you looked at the expertise in these fields, they suspected similar things like this were coming. So potentially putting those people in the lead of driving some of the policy and for these kind of things is important. I mean, that's what you hope will happen, and we'll see in the long run what comes of it.
Right. Anything for TJ or Mark on that one?
Well, I think there's two separate questions. One is societal, and hopefully we'll understand, and especially in the US, you would never see someone wearing a mask in prior years. Whereas if you traveled to Asia, you'd see it was certainly widespread when there was cold time of year and such. And I think there's appreciation also, we might put some forethought into these open offices, open labs, which we're all kind of crowded in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's often billed as a way to improve productivity, but those in the open offices often argued against that. So it'll give us a chance to think of, more broadly about how we would build infrastructure and our organizations so that they could handle any kind of future strain, whether it's exactly like this one, it's a similar pandemic, or something else that might just cause a quick shift in how we work. And we want to be able to get the clinical trials going, a few of the things that my two other speakers were describing. And we don't want to have other unforeseens derail our process of getting these drugs to the clinic.
Right. And I actually just came across this one that I think is a good question. Will this pandemic cause a shift of funding away from immuno-oncology and into a space that is more infectious disease and allogenic therapies?
I don't think so.
No.
No, I mean, the whole reason for the cell and gene therapies is to actually focus on treating underserved or not served disease in therapeutic areas. Patient needs. I mean, the needs of the patients haven't changed. And so COVID is an acute. It's worse than the flu, but it's a, you know, it's an illness that we're going to focus in, and we have as an industry put a lot of resources on the acute issues. I mean, this kind of goes back to societal change, what you were asking before, or what Alona, I believe you were asking that. And you know, I think what's interesting is the geopolitical shifts you're seeing. You know, you're seeing, you saw, I know my colleagues in Europe, it was interesting. They were in Switzerland, and they import a lot of their PPE. They imported the mask and a lot, and the shipments were stopped at the German and the Italian borders. The governments decided within Europe, no, we're not leaving our own countries. You know, so it was very interesting. I think the reactions, and they loosened up over time. You know, but I think the societal change that I'm really looking for is positive, you know, geopolitically, and hoping that, you know, it really does strengthen a lot of our partnerships. Yeah, that's just kind of my take on this. But from a funding perspective, you know, there's still a net needs there, and you know, all these innovators are looking to not only get a product to market, but also, you know, overall help patients. And this isn't going to change, and the investment's still there.
Right. And then this one I'm going to ask because obviously I focus on process development. So what kind of trends and findings came out of ASGCT for process development for gene therapy products? Were there any scale-up breakthroughs that were reported?
Scale-up breakthroughs, I didn't see particularly any scale-up breakthroughs per se. You're starting to see a bit more common large-scale manufacturing, large-scale like beyond 1,000 liters for AAV and Lenti, but I think I didn't see particularly breakthroughs yet, but I think people understanding the process more, what's in your process, what's coming out of it, I think is a much larger focus now than before, because, you know, since these things are advancing, the agencies are seeing these kind of products more often and asking more questions about the products themselves.
I think what I'm seeing is, you know, especially in AAV, a prevalence of packaging cell lines. You're seeing some more of these kind of come onto the market, and I think these are definitely they step up on the economic utility curve, you know, because they require less plasmids. And you know, I think the big question will be whether or not their affordability from a licensing perspective. But this is I think the biggest jump that I noticed was in packaging cell lines. Some more starting to come out. How good they are, they still need to be proven. I mean, you still got to make vector of them, put them in people, and make sure that they're doing their job. But that's the most interesting one I observed.
Okay. And then we have one more. Hopefully we can get one or two more in. But once a vaccine or treatment is developed, how available will this be to the public, and how will product manufacturers keep up with the demand? Mark, do you have any insight on that one?
Actually, I think Jorge Reyes, you and I were just trading notes on this one. You know, I think the manufacturers who have the know-how and the scale will definitely be the ones who are best positioned to meet the manufacturing needs. I don't think you're going to see a lot of like new greenfield investment, but you'll see the ones who have the capacity will then actually be able to utilize it. So you're going to see a large amount of demand in a small number of players. And that's just simply because the assets are already there and the capital's already been spent to actually bring online, you know, large scale manufacturing capacity. It's you know, we're talking a year plus just for the vaccine, and you're talking at least a year plus just to bring that online, not to mention the absolute millions of dollars that would cost. So I think it's the companies and the CMOs who already have it who will allocate that capacity to vaccine manufacturing because there's a demand for it. And then of course they would then expand in to further diversify their revenue streams. But this will actually lead, I think, to an opportunity for some of the smaller players to actually service you know, more of the gene therapy market where they've had a harder time kind of breaking in.
Right. And then I guess here's the last one. I know we have some regulatory affairs people on as well. So I know we touched on the job market briefly earlier from more of a lab-based kind of area. So what do you think that the job market looks like for people such as regulatory affairs people when they're not necessarily in the lab?
But I think Mark started off with this. I mean, I think the job areas that are at this point relatively untouched are the, regulatory affairs as a, thinking, writing, interacting with your agencies, and most of your agency interactions are remote at this point anyways. And so I think, the job market for regulatory affairs is very good. And I think with companies advancing trials, getting to BLAs or MAAs, I mean, I think the regulatory affairs people are, I think the market is very good. And I think, again, what Mark said is that those are jobs that, even if you start remotely, you can still, do most of the function of your job, if not all of it, moving forward.
Okay. And then we'll do one more question. Was there any data presented around immunity to AAV, lenti, or ways to mitigate immunity in order to treat patients?
There certainly was a number of different talks.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's a difficult problem. It's probably the lead problem, and probably immune responses have been talked about for a long time, and TJ can talk about this. But how you mitigate that, how you get around that, it's a very challenging problem. With pre-existing immunity, complement mediated inactivation, those are big challenges. I mean, these are challenges that they've had from bone marrow transplants for decades, and so we're not immune to that. Not to have some wordplay, but it's there's all kinds of data on it, and I think the serotypes are very important. And I think a bit alluding to back to what I was talking about, more and more focus will be on what's actually in your product. Not just the active ingredients, but what else is there. I think it's going to be a larger and larger focus moving forward.
Yeah, there's a whole range of companies and academic labs that are looking at the capsids through shuffling, through ancestral, through machine learning, through library screening, through, I mean, it's hard to go through how many players there are in this, and a range of different data presented on each of the organs you're targeting. So yes, there was a whole fire hose of data presented on the field, and it's probably going to be a while to shuffle through it.
Right. Okay, well, that puts us just at about 6 o'clock. So I guess that concludes our discussion for today. Special thanks to our panelists, TJ, Mark, and Brian. Thank you guys so much for being here with us today. And thank you to everybody who came. If anybody needs any help with any of their recruiting efforts in the future, please feel free to reach out to me via email or LinkedIn. Thank you guys so much, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.